This video is divided into 5 sections. I'll begin by briefly talking about my background, followed by my inspiration behind these projects. I'll then provide some historic context on the Somerset levels during the Iron Age, and discuss the process of researching and creating the soundscape. I'll end the video with some brief comments on the future of wetland ecosystems in Britain. I've attempted to bring this talk alive with natural sounds, some recorded by myself during my travels, and others from professional sound recordists. My name is Joseph Monkhouse. I'm a birdsong fanatic who is usually immersed in some natural history-themed venture. I hold an MSc in bird conservation and currently work as an ecologist in the renewable energy sector. In my early 20s, I spent 4 summers in Indonesia, researching the avifauna of southeast Sulawesi, largely in Wallacean lowland rainforests. I contributed to several scientific papers and led the first comprehensive account of the birds of Manui, a remote and poorly studied island. Here's one of my recordings of the dawn chorus there. I have a particular interest in birdsong, and this has been a running theme through most of my endeavours. I tend to identify birds by sound rather than sight, and prefer to record audio rather than take photos. Naturally, my MSc project was focused on bioacoustics, more specifically acoustic adaptation, investigating whether coots have evolved to use the surface of water to broadcast their calls. Alongside ecology work and other natural history projects, I like to put together birdsong-themed videos for the YouTube channel Birdkind, which I started with my friend Jack, a fellow wildlife enthusiast and birdwatcher. Initially, the videos comprised simple compilations of bird sounds, such as the nocturnal voices of British birds, but more recently the productions have become slightly more involved and conservation-orientated, focused on creating historic soundscapes. Combining my ornithological experience with a basic grasp of sound production picked up from a pastime of music composition, I felt I could try recreating the sounds of lost ecosystems. These soundscapes would be based on evidence, both observational and archaeological, with the aim to transport the listener into an immersive environment, whilst highlighting biodiversity loss in an auditory way. I wanted to convey a contrast between the past and the present, to perhaps reset the baseline of what people consider to be the biological norm of the British countryside, certainly with regards to diversity and density of species. It's difficult to comprehend the gradual degradation of our environment when it occurs over a lifetime, and even harder to imagine what it was like before we were born. Some may argue that the loss has been continuous, ever since the Neolithic migrants began clearing the Mesolithic forests to make way for agriculture. The classic line, "I remember when this was all trees," is all too poignant now. In 2019, the RSPB's conservation focus was on the dramatic decline in farmland birds. It felt appropriate to highlight this by reconstructing the sounds of a hay meadow set just over a century ago. This was before the great intensification of agriculture, where farms still served as rich and variable habitats, maintained by more traditional methods of farming. The meadowscape was based on evidence extracted from 6 dusty volumes of British Birds and Their Nests and Eggs by Arthur G. Butler, 1898, where I learnt that birds such as sow buntings and red-backed shrikes were commonplace in the south of England during that time. Now either one would attract a swarm of twitchers. Incredibly, the book also featured the great auk, though it did claim it was probably extinct by that point. The meadowscape had a very positive reception. I didn't anticipate something quite as niche to appeal to so many people, and it was uplifting to find that others shared my longing for ecological time travel. Aside from the pure enjoyment of making it, the feedback gave me further incentive to continue with the theme of historic soundscapes, and try out a different habitat in a different era of British history. I settled with 2,000 years ago, deep within the lost wild wetlands of the West Country. My plan to travel back 2 millennia was inspired by a recent interest in British prehistory. This was ignited by discovering that my local patch for birdwatching, a short walk from my residence, is in fact an Iron Age hill fort. The undulating multivalent ramparts have remained impressively deep and very discernible within the now mature oaken beech woodland that covers it. 2,000 years ago it would have been open country, overlooking the 2 key rivers in the area, the Pang to the north and the Kennet to the south. The Iron Age people left behind an enduring mark on our landscape. their great monuments still prevailing in the 3,000 plus hill forts etched into our hills and plateaus. Yet with virtually no written documentation, the age remains charmingly enigmatic. I wanted to experience it. While operational, the open country of my local hill fort of Grimsby Castle would have supported many species found in the hay meadows of 1900. Thus I decided that a wetland habitat would allow me to experiment with different sounds and include some charismatic creatures that are now absent from our countryside. The most extensive wetland assemblage of species from the Iron Age has been unearthed from the Somerset Levels in 2 lake villages, Glastonbury and Mere. These excavations allowed me to draw from real evidence to provide a partially accurate soundscape. Furthermore, the Somerset Levels is often regarded as an ideal location for future rewilding projects, most notably imagined in Benedict MacDonald's recent book, Rebirding, where he postulates a very idyllic future Britain if we embrace rewilding as a nation. The animal remains were found amongst the vestiges of prehistoric suppers that had endured 2 millennia preserved in the ground. Glastonbury Lake Village, the larger of the two, comprised up to 20 roundhouses at its peak, with a wooden stone causeway and palisade stakes bordering the settlement. The villagers' diet was varied, partially consisting of wild and domesticated species. Evidence of lead sinkers for nets and baked clay slingshots indicated how the wild animals were caught. Living on the wetlands meant that agricultural farming was limited. However, a substantial amount of barley, beans and peas were present too, grown on drier land and perhaps obtained by trading fish or wildfowl. Bones of coastal bird species such as puffin, cormorant and Manx shearwater also suggested some contact with the coast. The residents likely traded furs of beaver and otter with neighbouring communities, using canoes to travel through the open water channels. The entire levels would have covered approximately 160,000 acres, a vast mosaic of shallow open water, wet alder and willow woodland, reed swamp and sedge fen. It wasn't until the Middle Ages that significant changes to the landscape occurred. Rivers were diverted, large swathes of wetland were drained and livestock was grazed in pasture land. I find the historical elements fascinating as it helps place myself in the landscape, though my focus for this project was on the natural sounds. The History of British Birds by Derek Yalden served as my primary reference material. The book presents a timeline of birds in Britain, starting in the Cretaceous and ending in the present day, drawing evidence from paleontological and archaeological excavations. The book provided a comprehensive list of all positively identified species recovered from the Somerset Lake villages. With such a substantial catalogue of species, I had the ability to choose what time of year to set the soundscape. I considered early winter, with immense migratory flocks of wildfowl arriving from Scandinavia. But I settled for early spring instead, a more vibrant melodic chorus, punctuated by bugling cranes and booming bitterns. There is something quite archaic about a bitterns' territorial call, a cross between a bellowing war horn and a large drum, sparking a range of charming regional names for the bird: bumble, butterbump, bog drum, Maya drumble, bog bumper, bull of the bog. The list goes on. Most of the bird remains recovered in the excavations comprise medium to large size species, though a plausible natural soundscape requires all layers of the biological orchestra, from sea eagles to sedge warblers. Songbirds were largely absent from the sites. Their skeletons are too fine and fragile and seldom survive long in the peat. Fortunately, evidence of their archetypal predators, marsh harrier, Montague's harrier and sparrowhawk, were discovered, thus alluding to the occurrence of small passerines. I represented these anonymous songsters with those that frequent modern-day wetlands, foremost in Britain but also in mainland Europe, being careful not to include our most recent arrivals, such as the Chetty's warbler, as their range expansion is driven, in part, by climate change. When imagining the density and diversity of sound, I drew from my past experiences of the primary rainforest of Sulawesi, where the resident calls of white-bellied imperial pigeons are accompanied by cascades of eerie black-headed kingfisher whistles that ripple across the forest. It's such a unique composition of sounds to that part of the world, especially as a large proportion of the species are endemic to Sulawesi. At the time, the forests were an unblemished ecosystem, vast and void of human life. This was evident in the dawn chorus, a continuous chain reaction of calls only limited by audible range. The familiar crow of a distant village cockerel briefly pulled me back to civilization, until I realised it was actually a red jungle fowl, the wild descendant of the domestic chicken, and I was rapidly pushed back into the wilderness again. Far closer to home, I was inspired by 2 recent trips to Poland's primeval forest, Białowieża. Several species I observed there also lived in the Somerset Levels during the Iron Age. The old-growth forest, interspersed with clearings and wetland habitats, supports a surprising assortment of species living in close proximity and sharing one acoustic domain. This medley of habitats is less evident in Britain, where species are typically restricted to habitat islands, many of which are human-constructed. Yellowhammers, for example, are primarily farmland birds in Britain, often restricted to hedgerows that border arable crops. In Białowieża, you can see them in a presumed natural state, appearing unexpectedly in clearings deep in the forest, living on patches of scrub and singing alongside wood warblers and redstarts. The Somerset Levels, although predominantly wetland, would have supported a similar amalgam of habitats, and I am sure that this was reflected in the soundscape. We're fortunate that a vast and comprehensive archive of the world's bird sounds are available for download on zenacanto.org, uploaded by sound recordists across the globe. To ensure the sounds blend convincingly into the soundscape, the audio tracks must be largely free of background noise, especially anthropogenic sounds. Distant motorways or airplane flyovers are most often present. Once I had obtained the sounds, I required a visual backdrop. Southwest Heritage Trust kindly granted me permission to use their digital model of Glastonbury Lake Village. In addition to providing a visual accompaniment to the soundtrack, it allowed me to synchronise the audio tracks to a moving template. The inclusion of settlements in the CGI recreation provided an opportunity to subtly weave human sounds into the background ambience, denoting their presence in the wetlands, whilst implying minimal dominion over it. I won't go into too much detail about the technical side of creating the video. I should retain some mystery to the method, but to give you a rough idea of how it was put together, it's useful to know about panning and layering. First of all, panning allows you to control the position of a sound source from the left ear to the right, and helps to create the sense that the sound is coming from all directions. Most importantly for this, it allows you to synchronise each sound to a visual display. Panning introduces a multi-dimensional element to the soundscape, but to truly convey space and depth, the sounds must be carefully and repeatedly layered at varying volumes. European temperate wetlands in spring are almost always accompanied by a relentless chattering chorus of warblers. To create this warbler backing track, I constructed a separate soundscape composed of all these species. I then placed the warbler chorus in both the left and the right headphone with a panning control, and set each audio track to low volumes to give the impression that the sound continued beyond hearing range. The final production comprised 44 species spread over 73 recordings, blended into a 6-minute audio track. Roughly 2/3 were species validated by Iron Age remains, including several iconic birds: Dalmatian pelican, common crane, western osprey and white-tailed eagle. It was thrilling to interlace these 4 evocative creatures into one acoustic environment, each cool a unique depiction of wilderness. Although the Somerset Levels has experienced significant environmental changes in the past 2,000 years, it has remained an important area for wildlife into the present day, and a prime destination for wildlife enthusiasts, often drawn in by impressive starling murmurations that occur in midwinter. Steps to improve and expand the wetlands are ongoing. A recent not-for-profit initiative, spearheaded by Somerset Wildlands, is focused on acquiring areas of farmland to create a large network of rewilded habitat islands throughout the levels. It is likely that the project will be enhanced by the reintroduction of the European beaver. By felling trees and building dams, beavers are the natural architects of riparian habitats, and a nationwide reintroduction programme is proving their effectiveness and not only enhancing wetland habitats for wildlife, but also reducing soil erosion and decreasing flood damage downstream. This combination of rewilding, reintroductions and setting aside more land for wildlife may help to re-establish the original soundtrack of the Somerset Levels, and hopefully make my artificial soundscape into a reality. I certainly plan to make more soundscapes in the future. I'm eagerly awaiting spring to obtain footage of an old-growth woodland. This will be the backdrop for a Mesolithic arboreal soundscape. I would also like to fast forward 50 years into the future to an idyllic naturalised cityscape, with skylarks rising up from skyscrapers and goshawks swooping through parkland. In a moment, I'll play the soundscape in its entirety. If you would like to hear more and are interested in keeping up to date with my projects, please follow me on Twitter at Joseph Monkhouse and subscribe to the YouTube channel Birdkind. To avoid distracting from the audio and to help create an immersive experience, I've decided to keep the video free from narration and annotations. Anyone curious about the bird sounds featured can find a timestamped species list in the video description below. Thank you for listening.